We are so happy that you are here with us today, ready to share a story that breathes longing, silence, and the courage needed to face what we once abandoned. We hope you will delve deeply into this journey with us. Where are you watching from? Write in the comments. We would love to know who is listening from the other side of the world. There are moments in life when the heart composes letters that the hand refuses to send, when words accumulate like autumn leaves against a closed door, beautiful and doomed to failure, never reaching their destination. Eleanor Hartwell knew this truth better than most, for she had lived 32 years with the ghostly weight of yellowed pages in a drawer. She was now at the window of her modest home in Hartford, Connecticut, watching the October rain trace rivulets across the glass. And she thought of the autumn of 1906, when she was 24 and reckless enough to believe that love could be captured in ink, that vulnerability could be folded into an envelope and delivered to the mercy of the world. She had written the letter in a fit of clarity, pouring out her heart to Thomas Ashford with a nakedness that both terrified and thrilled her. But when dawn arrived and reason returned with its cold, firm voice, she sealed the letter and hid it away, telling herself she was being wise, that she was protecting herself from inevitable rejection. How many times had she replayed that choice in the theater of her mind, imagining what would have happened if she had simply gone to the post office and delivered those pages to their destination? The question had become a kind of companion, a secret so familiar that it no longer seemed a burden, just part of the landscape of who she had become. Eleanor had built a respectable life in the years that followed. She worked as a governess for the children of Hartford's wealthiest families, attended church on Sundays, had tea with the same 3 friends every Thursday afternoon, and told herself that satisfaction was enough, that the great passions of youth were to be overcome like children's shoes that pinch and bother. But there were nights when she woke with the feeling of having lost something precious, when the darkness pressed against her chest, and she remembered how Thomas had looked at her during that last summer they spent together, before he left for Boston to pursue his ambitions, before distance, pride, and her own cowardice transformed the possibility into a memory. She remembered how his eyes examined her, as if he were trying to read something she didn't have the courage to write on his face, and she remembered turning away, offering him only a polite goodbye and a handshake that felt like a betrayal of everything they could have been. Who among us has never been at a crossroads like that, never felt the terrible seduction of security, the way fear can disguise itself as wisdom and convince us that retreating is the same as maturity? Eleanor understood now with the clarity that only time and regret can bring. She had become a woman who moved through the world with grace and competence, valued by her employers and respected by her peers, but who felt, in her most sincere moments, like an empty house. The letter remained in her possession, kept in a wooden box under her winter scarves, and sometimes she would take it out and read the words of her younger self, marveling at the courage she had once possessed in private, even if she lacked it in public. But life, Eleanor had discovered, doesn't respect the stories we tell ourselves about closure and moving on. It has a way of coming back, of presenting us with the same tests we thought we had definitively failed, asking us if we've learned anything in the meantime, if we're capable of making different choices now. On the morning the telegram arrived, she was preparing lessons for the youngest Pemberton daughter, a 7-year-old girl who showed a remarkable aptitude for geography and an unfortunate tendency to daydream during math class. And Eleanor was thinking about how to make fractions more interesting when the doorbell rang, and Mrs. Crowley from next door appeared with the thin yellow envelope that always meant important news that couldn't wait for the regular mail. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, though she had no idea what it contained. The message was brief, formal, impersonal, informing her that the Hartford Board of Education was organizing a reception for Mr. Thomas Ashford, who had recently been appointed superintendent of schools for the entire state of Connecticut, and that, as a respected member of the educational community, Miss Eleanor Hartwell was cordially invited to attend the event scheduled for the following Saturday evening at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. She read the words 3 times before their meaning fully sank in, her mind struggling to reconcile the Thomas she had known, ambitious, with this version that had apparently risen to a position of considerable power and influence. Would she recognize him? Would he recognize her? And even more disturbing, would he remember that past summer, the way they talked about everything and nothing, building a bridge between their inner worlds that had seemed more real than anything else in Eleanor's life? a bridge she had refused to cross when it mattered most. Eleanor found herself at another crossroads, facing another choice between safety and risk, between the familiar landscape of her solitary life and the uncertain territory of facing Thomas Ashford again, of seeing in his eyes the confirmation that she had been right to remain silent, or the devastating proof that her silence had been the greatest mistake of her life. The letter had been written one night when the moon was low and full over Hartford, and Eleanor had felt, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, that she was on the verge of something important, that the universe was offering her the opportunity to live a different version of her own story. She took her good writing paper, sat at her small desk with a single candle lit, and let the words flow without censoring them. The letter began simply, "Dear Thomas." But what followed was anything but simple, a cascade of confessions and vulnerabilities that seemed both terrifying and necessary. Words that admitted what she had been afraid to say when they were together. That she valued his friendship immensely, that she had come to care for him in ways that transcended the limits of a simple friendship. She had written about the peculiarity of the loneliness that arises from being surrounded by people who know your name, but not your essence, about how she imagined a future in which they could continue to explore the world together, not as friends who merely tolerated each other's company, but as true partners who understood that intimacy is built not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 small moments of genuine attention and care. The letter was 4 pages long, dense with feelings and details. And as Eleanor wrote, she felt a kind of euphoria, the feeling that she was finally being honest, not only with Thomas, but with herself, that she was claiming her own desires instead of pretending they didn't exist. But as the night wore on and the candle burned less and less, Eleanor began to hear other voices in her mind. Voices that whispered warnings and raised questions she couldn't easily dismiss. What if Thomas didn't feel the same way? What if she was misinterpreting everything, projecting her own feelings onto his kindness, confusing the genuine pleasure he felt in their conversations with something deeper and more romantic than he had ever intended? These thoughts began to multiply like shadows in the corners of her room, and as the dawn light began to penetrate the curtains, Eleanor's euphoria turned into something close to dread, a cold certainty that sending the letter would be a catastrophic mistake, that she would expose herself to humiliation and loss, that Thomas would read her words and feel pity, or worse, embarrassment for her. Don't we all know this particular agony, this war between longing and self-preservation, between the part of us that wants to reach out across the distance that separates us from another human being, and the part that is convinced that such an attempt will only result in our hand being rejected? Eleanor sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote Thomas's name and Boston address on the front in careful, steady handwriting, and then sat holding it, feeling the light weight of those 4 pages, those hundreds of words that contained so much of her heart, and realized she couldn't move, couldn't get up and walk to the door and go to the post office. She told herself she would send it tomorrow, that she just needed time to be sure, but tomorrow came and went, and then another tomorrow, and another, until the letter settled permanently on her desk, and Thomas left Hartford for his new post in Boston. And the moment, if there ever was a real moment, passed. Eleanor had convinced herself that this was for the best, that she had almost made a fool of herself, that Thomas would have been kind but clear in his rejection, and that she would have lost even his friendship, which would have been unbearable. Years passed, and the letter became a kind of talisman, a reminder of both her capacity for deep feelings and her lack of courage. Eleanor tried to come to terms with the choice she had made, tried to convince herself that some things are better left unexpressed, that not all love stories have happy endings. She even wondered, in her darkest moments, if the letter had less to do with a genuine connection to Thomas and more to do with her own romantic fantasies. But even questioning the authenticity of her younger self's feelings, she couldn't completely dismiss them, couldn't fully convince herself that what she had felt for Thomas Ashford was anything less than real. Subscribe, like, and share to get more stories like this. We dedicate our hearts to creating these journeys, and your support means a lot to us to continue. The days between receiving the telegram and the reception itself passed with a strange sense of suspension, as if time itself had become elastic, stretching and contracting according to the intensity of Eleanor's thoughts, which oscillated drastically between the determination to attend the event and convincing herself that she was totally indifferent to Thomas Ashford's return. and the panic at the prospect of seeing him again. She stood before the wardrobe, trying to decide what to wear, aware that the choice mattered more than it should, that she was trapped in the absurd snare of wanting to look beautiful enough to make him lament the lost connection between them, while at the same time wishing to appear so satisfied and self-sufficient. The dress she finally chose was dark burgundy silk with discreet details, elegant without being ostentatious, suggesting good taste. And as she studied her reflection in the mirror on the night of the reception, Eleanor tried to gauge how Thomas would see her, tried to determine whether 8 years had been kind or cruel, whether the lines beginning to appear at the corners of her eyes indicated wisdom or just weariness. Thomas Ashford had indeed changed, though Eleanor might not have noticed the extent of those changes had she met him by chance. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps simply carried himself differently, and his face had lost the softness and uncertainties of youth, sculpted by experience into something more defined, more angular, though his eyes, when they finally met hers across the crowded room, still retained that peculiar quality of attentiveness she remembered. That way he looked at a person as if they were the only thing in the world that mattered at that moment. Eleanor felt her heart perform a complex acrobatic movement in her chest, part recognition and part sadness, because this man was and was not the Thomas she had known, and she was and was not the Eleanor who had loved him. Their initial exchange, when Thomas finally pushed his way through the crowd to greet her, was everything such encounters usually are. Cordial, superficial, carefully choreographed to reveal nothing substantial, maintaining all forms of civility that society demands of people who share a complicated history. He said she looked well, and she returned the compliment, and they chatted briefly about the changes in Hartford, about the growth of the city's educational infrastructure, conversations that could have been conducted by any two people who once knew each other superficially, and now exchanged pleasantries across the chasm of time and circumstances. But behind the conventional words, Eleanor sensed something more, a current of recognition or perhaps curiosity, moments when Thomas's gaze lingered on her face a little longer than necessary, as if he were trying to read beyond her careful responses. What surprised Eleanor most was not the awkwardness of the encounter, but rather how quickly they settled into a familiar rhythm, how easily the conversation deepened as soon as they moved away from the crowd. Thomas asked her about her work with the children of Pemberton, and she found herself telling him not only the facts, but also their essence, the particular challenges and rewards, and he listened with what seemed like genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was truly absorbing what she was saying, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. They talked about books they had read, about the changes they had both observed in American society, and Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a tight knot of defensiveness beginning to unravel, as if her body remembered this particular quality of conversation, this feeling of being welcomed intellectually and emotionally. But even as Eleanor found herself relaxing into something reminiscent of their former ease with each other, she was aware of all that remained unspoken between them, aware that they were avoiding the real questions, the ones that mattered. Why had they let their connection dissolve? Did he feel what she felt, or was she alone in her longing? Had he ever wondered what might have happened if one of them had been brave enough to acknowledge what was building between them before distance, time, and their own fears had completely dismantled it? Eleanor wanted to ask these questions and, at the same time, wanted to protect herself from the answers. She wasn't sure if she was prepared for whatever truths might emerge if they abandoned the safety of pleasant memories and ventured into more honest territory. The night was drawing to a close, people were starting to leave, and Thomas was commenting on how good it had been to see her again, how he hoped they could continue their conversation sometime in the future. And Eleanor heard herself agreeing, giving him her address and feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified about what would come next, whether this reconnection was just a pleasant coincidence or not. Thomas's letter arrived 3 days after the reception, brought by a messenger who anxiously awaited a reply until Eleanor explained that none would come immediately, that she needed time to read and reflect on what had been written, although in truth, she had already guessed the general content of the letter from the moment she saw the sender. Eleanor waited until nightfall to open it, when the house was quiet and she could devote her full attention to the letter, and found herself handling the pages with the same reverence she would dedicate to historical documents, aware that what she read had the power to reshape her understanding not only of Thomas but also of her own past. Thomas wrote about seeing her again, about how the encounter awakened memories he thought he had successfully filed away in the category of pleasant yet concluded experiences, about how surprised he was by the intensity of his own reaction to the conversation, the way it reminded him of who he had been before ambition and professional success became the main organizing principles of his life. He wrote about his years in Boston, about how he threw himself into the work partly because it was genuinely meaningful to him, and partly because it filled the spaces where other things, relationships, intimacy, might have existed if he had been willing to make room for them. Thomas confessed with a frankness that left Eleanor breathless that he had thought about her often over the years, that the summer they spent together had meant something important to him, a period in which he had felt seen and understood in ways that had become increasingly rare as he rose to positions of greater responsibility and visibility. He said he regretted that the connection between them had faded, that he took responsibility for not having tried harder to maintain it, that at the time he had convinced himself that definitive breakups were easier than prolonged goodbyes. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new points of connection to her own experience, and she felt something shifting within her, some crystallized belief about the past beginning to crack and crumble. For 8 years she had told herself a story in which her feelings for Thomas were one-sided, that he had left Hartford without looking back and built a successful life that had no room for her. But this letter suggested a different narrative, one in which Thomas had been as confused and uncertain as she was, in which the connection between them had been real and mutual, but neither had had the courage to fight for it when distance and circumstances threatened to tear them apart. What would have happened, Eleanor wondered, if she had sent the letter? Would it have reached him during those first months in Boston, when he was, according to his current account, lonely and insecure, and perhaps open to the possibility of maintaining the connection despite the geographical separation? Or would it have arrived at a time when he was too focused on establishing himself professionally to give her the attention she deserved, when the complications of a romantic relationship would seem an unwanted distraction from his career ambitions? The question was unanswerable, of course, one of those endless hypotheses that torment us precisely because they have no solution, because the past is immutable, even if our understanding of it continues to evolve. And Eleanor found herself at yet another crossroads, facing yet another decision about how much of herself she should reveal, whether she should respond to Thomas's letter with the same frankness or maintain some measure of self-protection. She thought about the letter she had written 8 years ago, still kept in her wooden box, and wondered if she should show it to Thomas. What would he think if he knew she had written those pages, that she had come so close to sending them, that she had loved him enough to compose a confession, but not enough to risk delivering it? Would he see the letter as proof of her feelings or as evidence of her reluctance to take the leap that a genuine connection requires? Thomas's letter ended with an invitation to meet again, not at a public event or formal gathering, but privately, for a walk along the river on Sunday afternoon, weather permitting. Eleanor knew that accepting this invitation would be different from attending the museum reception. It would represent a conscious choice to move beyond the realm of polite social interaction and into more personal territory, full of possibilities and risks. She sat at her desk, the same one where she had composed the letter she had never sent so many years ago, and began to craft her reply, choosing each word carefully, trying to match Thomas's tone of honest reflection without revealing so much as to leave herself completely defenseless. She tried to convey that she too had been affected by the reunion, that she too had spent the following years reflecting on untrodden paths, that she was open to exploring what this renewed connection could become, while also being realistic about the challenges they would face, about the fact that they were no longer the same people. As she wrote, Eleanor felt herself oscillating between hope and caution, between the desire to finally take the risk she had avoided before, and the awareness that taking such risks always brings with it the possibility of pain. Their Sunday stroll along the Connecticut River began with the same careful politeness that had characterized their reunion at the museum. Both navigated the space between the familiar and the strange, both aware that they were attempting something delicate, trying to determine whether the connection they once shared was a product of youth and circumstance, or something more lasting, something capable of surviving the weight of years. The afternoon was clear and cool, and they walked side by side along the path parallel to the water, their steps synchronized effortlessly. Eleanor perceived this synchronicity in the same way she had once noticed everything about Thomas. Initially, they talked about superficial matters, the beauty of the season, the changes on the riverbank, conversations that seemed like warm-up exercises, like musicians tuning their instruments before attempting a more complex piece. But gradually, as they moved away from the city center and the road became less busy, the conversation began to deepen, touching on more personal matters. And Thomas asked Eleanor about her life with a specificity that suggested he genuinely wanted to understand not only the facts of her existence but its quality. Whether she was happy, whether she felt she was living the life she wanted, or just the life that circumstances and her own choices had provided. The question caught her off guard, partly because it was more direct than most social questions, and partly because she wasn't sure how to answer honestly without revealing more than she intended about her disappointments and regrets. She told him that she found satisfaction in her work, that she valued the relationship she had built, that she had learned to appreciate stability and predictability after years of uncertainty about what the future held for her, and all of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Thomas listened attentively to her response, and then, after a pause during which Eleanor could almost hear him pondering whether to insist or accept what she had said, he stated that he recognized something in her description, that he too had built a life that seemed successful on the outside, but often felt empty on the inside, that he had achieved most of his professional goals only to discover that achievement alone is not the same as fulfillment. He spoke of the peculiar loneliness of holding positions of authority, of how people treat him differently when he has the power to affect their careers or livelihoods, of how relationships become strategic rather than spontaneous. Who would have thought that success could be a trap in itself, that achieving what one desires could reveal how little one truly wanted it? Eleanor looked at Thomas as he spoke, seeing him more clearly than in the museum, seeing beyond the confidence and polish something more vulnerable and uncertain beneath, and felt a strange mixture of compassion and affinity, the recognition that both, each in their own way, had chosen safety over risk. They reached a bench overlooking the river and sat down without speaking, both seeming to need a moment to rest, to let the conversation calm down before continuing. Thomas asked her after another period of comfortable silence if she had ever thought about that summer they spent together, if it meant anything to her or if he had exaggerated its significance in his own memory. The question hung in the air between them, laden with vulnerability and risk. And Eleanor knew that her answer would determine everything that would happen next, that telling the truth could open doors she had carefully kept locked for years, could expose her to the very rejection she had spent 8 years trying to avoid. But that lying or even equivocating would mean losing any chance they had of building something real. She saw the letter in her mind, those pages she had written and never sent, and wondered again if she should tell him about it, if that old confession could serve as a shortcut amidst all the careful dance they were practicing. But something held her back, an instinct that told her the moment wasn't right, that she needed to better understand his feelings before revealing the full extent of her own, that she had already taken enough risks by being there, allowing herself to hope that this reconnection could lead to something meaningful instead of simply reopening old wounds and creating new ones. The discovery of the letter happened in the same way as most important revelations, by chance and coincidence. Margaret Pemberton, the eldest daughter of Eleanor's employers, was 12 years old and possessed both the natural curiosity of her age and a tendency to explore spaces to which she had not been explicitly invited. One Tuesday afternoon, when Eleanor had to leave unexpectedly to resolve a small domestic problem, Margaret found herself alone in Eleanor's small living room, where lessons usually took place, and began, like children who cannot resist the fascination of closed boxes and private drawers, to investigate the wooden container that Eleanor kept under her winter scarves. The letter was there, along with other mementos from Eleanor's past, photographs, pressed flowers, a ribbon that had once held special significance, and Margaret, who had recently discovered novels and was beginning to develop theories about love and relationships based primarily on fictional accounts, immediately recognized that the pages she had found represented something important, something secret, something the adults in her life definitely wouldn't want her to read, but which she absolutely couldn't resist reading. Margaret was not a malicious child, only curious. She read Eleanor's confession to Thomas with the fascinated attention of someone encountering adult emotions in their purest form for the first time. She read about longing and fear, about the courage needed to tell the truth and the different kind of courage needed to remain silent. Something in Margaret's young heart was touched by this evidence of her governess's hidden depths, this proof that Miss Hartwell was not simply the patient and somewhat distant figure who taught her geography and literature, but a woman who had loved, suffered, and struggled with issues that Margaret herself was only beginning to understand. But Margaret was also 12 years old, which meant she possessed a limited capacity for discretion. And at dinner that evening, she made the catastrophic mistake of mentioning to her mother that she had discovered Miss Hartwell had once written a love letter to a man named Thomas Ashford. Wasn't that interesting? Wasn't that romantic? Although apparently the letter had never been sent, which seemed sad. Didn't her mother find it sad? Elizabeth Pemberton was a woman of strong opinions and even stronger social connections. Someone who collected information about others like some people collect china or first editions. Someone who instinctively understood that knowledge was a form of currency in Hartford's social economy. And she immediately recognized Thomas Ashford's name from the recent reception. Someone whose connection to her children's governess could be explored or, at the very least, discussed with her extensive network of friends who would find the story delightful, who would appreciate the irony of the sensible Miss Hartwell harboring secret romantic feelings, who would speculate endlessly about why the letter had never been sent, and whether Thomas Ashford had ever suspected her affection. Elizabeth questioned Margaret about the letter with an intensity that should have alerted the child to her mistake, extracting details about what was written and where the letter was kept. Within 48 hours, the story spread through Hartford's interconnected social circles, with the speed and efficiency of telegrams, gaining embellishments and distortions with each new version, transforming from a private confession into public entertainment. From Eleanor's personal story into Hartford's latest scandal, Eleanor learned of the exposure not from Margaret, but from her friend Sarah Whitmore, who appeared at Eleanor's door on Thursday evening with the expression of someone bearing bad news she would rather avoid. Sarah explained with evident discomfort that Eleanor's letter to Thomas Ashford had become the subject of general conversation, that people discussed it at teas and dinners, that some saw it as romantic while others considered it pathetic, that Thomas himself had almost certainly heard of it given how quickly gossip spread, and that Eleanor needed to prepare herself for the social consequences of having her intimate feelings exposed and examined by people who had no right to them and no understanding of the circumstances that had produced them. Eleanor listened to this recitation with a growing sense of horror and disbelief, feeling as if her inner life had been turned inside out and exposed to the public, as if the most vulnerable parts of herself were now being manipulated by strangers who would judge, reject, and mock what they could not understand. The violation wasn't just about embarrassment, but about having her private emotional world turned into a public spectacle, having something that belonged to her and Thomas taken away. Eleanor thought about Thomas hearing this story and imagined his reaction. He would feel flattered or embarrassed or simply uncomfortable with the public discussion of private matters. The letter had existed for 8 years in a kind of limbo, never sent nor destroyed, and now it had finally been sent, but in the worst possible way, through violation and exposure, and not by Eleanor's conscious choice. And she felt as if she had lost control not only of her story, but also of her dignity, her privacy, her right to decide when, how, and if she would reveal her feelings. Thomas appeared at Eleanor's door on Saturday morning, earlier than any social visit should have taken place, and she knew from his expression that he had heard of the letter, and she felt simultaneously grateful for his frankness and terrified of what this conversation would reveal, what it would require her to acknowledge, what it might destroy of the careful reconnection they had been building over the past few weeks. She invited him into her modest living room, and they sat in chairs positioned at angles that allowed them to see each other without the frontal intensity of a direct confrontation, approaching the truth obliquely rather than directly, always maintaining enough distance to preserve some measure of self-protection. Thomas spoke first in a soft voice but with direct words. He said that he had indeed heard of the letter, that people were surprisingly eager to inform him of its existence and contents, that he understood she must be mortified by the exposure, but that he wanted to hear the truth directly from her, rather than relying on second-hand accounts that might or might not accurately represent what she had written, what she had felt, what she wanted him to know. Eleanor felt something inside her break, some final barrier crumbling under the pressure of weeks of renewed connection and the utter impossibility of keeping up appearances any longer. And she found herself telling him everything, about writing the letter that late summer night, about how she convinced herself that sending it would destroy their friendship and expose her to certain rejection, about how she kept the letter for 8 years as proof of her capacity for deep feeling, and as a reminder of her lack of courage. She told him about the years that had passed, about how she had built a respectable life, but she never stopped wondering what might have happened if she had been braver. As Eleanor spoke, she watched Thomas's face for signs of discomfort, pity, or embarrassment, prepared to see evidence that his feelings were unwanted or a burden. But instead, she saw something else in his expression, surprise certainly, but also something that seemed like recognition, relief, the expression of someone who had carried a question for so long that learning the answer, however complicated, felt like a form of liberation. When Eleanor finished speaking, Thomas sat in silence for a time that seemed like a small eternity, but which probably lasted only a minute or two, and then began to tell his own truth, his own version of that summer and the years that followed. He confessed that he had been half in love with her during those months, that the conversations between them were the highlight of his days, that he had postponed his departure for Boston twice because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving, that he had waited for her to give him some sign that she felt something more than friendship, some indication that the bond between them was as meaningful to her as it was to him. He said that when that sign didn't come, when she maintained her friendly demeanor, when she said goodbye with nothing more than a polite handshake and wishes of success, he convinced himself that he had misinterpreted everything, that his feelings were one-sided. Thomas spoke of his arrival in Boston, feeling simultaneously enthusiastic about his professional prospects and deprived of the connection he had left behind, of how he had thrown himself into work in part to avoid loneliness and disappointment, of how he had occasionally thought of writing to her, but had convinced himself that she had already moved on, that she probably barely thought of him, that any attempt to maintain contact would seem pathetic or desperate. His words reflected Eleanor's own experience. Two people wanting the same thing, but each convinced that the other didn't want it. Both waiting for a sign that never came because each was too afraid to give it. Eleanor stared intently at Thomas as he spoke, trying to reconcile what he was saying with the story she had been telling herself for 8 years. And she felt a wave of sadness for all the lost time, all the unnecessary loneliness, all the years they had both spent convinced they were protecting each other when in fact, they were only imprisoning themselves in fear. But mixed in with the pain there was something else, a kind of admiration, the feeling that even amidst this uncomfortable exposure and forced confrontation, they were finally being honest with each other. Thomas asked if he could read the letter, the pages she had written 8 years ago, and Eleanor hesitated only briefly before taking it from its wooden box, the pages softened by years of handling, watching his face as he read, seeing his expression shift from curiosity to something deeper, something that seemed like recognition, regret, and admiration, all mixed together in equal measure. Upon finishing the reading, Thomas carefully folded the pages and said he wished she had sent the letter, that receiving it in Boston, when he felt alone and insecure, would have changed everything, would have brought him back to Hartford, or would have taken her to Boston, would have given them the chance to build something instead of spending 8 years in separate silences. But he also said that perhaps they needed those 8 years, the experiences, the growth, and the self-knowledge that came with building their separate lives, needed to become the people they were now before they could truly appreciate what they could build together. Eleanor wanted to believe that, wanted to accept the narrative that everything happens for a reason, that their reunion now was somehow better or more meaningful than it would have been if she had sent the letter originally. But she also knew that this was partly consolation, partly a story they told themselves to make the lost years bearable. What she knew for sure was that they were there now, in that moment, finally being honest with each other after years of protective silence, finally acknowledging what they both felt, feared, and desired. And when Thomas reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, an old weight beginning to dissipate. The social fallout from the letter's release continued to reverberate through Hartford's social networks. But Eleanor discovered she cared less about public opinion than she had imagined. She found that having the truth known, however confusing or non-consensual, was somehow preferable to maintaining the elaborate charade of having no emotional history, intimate desires, or complex feelings about anything. Soon after the conversation, Thomas withdrew somewhat from public life, canceling several social engagements and spending more time at the office. Eleanor wondered if he was processing what had been revealed, reconsidering his desires, rethinking the idea of investing in a relationship with so much history, exposure, and potential for further complications. But then he wrote to her again, a letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning containing no declarations or decisions but questions, genuine questions about who she was now, what she wanted from life, what scared her, what made her feel most alive, what concessions she had made regarding her own dreams, and whether she still harbored desires she hadn't even expressed to herself. Thomas's letter suggested that he was interested not only in revisiting what they had or could have had, but in understanding who Eleanor truly was in the present, with all her experiences, disappointments, and hard-won wisdom. She found this approach both intimidating and deeply appealing, and felt compelled to accept the challenge of an honest self-representation rather than hiding behind the easier masks of nostalgia or an idealized self-presentation. She responded with equal frankness, admitting that she had spent years prioritizing security over passion, that she had built a life that seemed manageable, but often devoid of enthusiasm. Their correspondence in the following weeks became a kind of prolonged excavation, each letter delving into the archaeology of their respective feelings and experiences. They were building something through these written exchanges, something more substantial than the initial reconnection at the museum, something that felt like the foundation of real intimacy, rather than merely the rekindling of an old affection. What emerged from this long dialogue was a portrait not of who they were 8 years ago, but of who they had become through the accumulation of choices and circumstances, and the slow work of living. Both Eleanor and Thomas seemed to recognize that any relationship they built now would have to take into account these more complex and experienced versions of themselves, rather than trying to recover or recreate an idealized past that perhaps never existed exactly as they remembered it. The letters became increasingly vulnerable, increasingly willing to risk being exposed, increasingly honest about their fears and failures, and about the ways in which they had both made concessions to their own ideals. Thomas confessed that he was afraid of disappointing her, afraid that the reality of lasting intimacy would reveal him to be less interesting or admirable than she imagined, afraid that his work habits and solitude were so ingrained that he didn't know if he was truly capable of the kind of partnership that demands constant emotional availability and vulnerability. Eleanor admitted her own fears, that she had become so accustomed to independence that she might resist the commitments a relationship requires, that she might protect herself out of habit, even when no protection was necessary. But even as they articulated these fears, even as they acknowledged all the ways in which they could fail each other or themselves, something was building between them that felt different from their first connection, more solid, more realistic. Thomas began visiting Eleanor on Sunday afternoons, and they would walk along the river or sit in her small living room drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing, building a new vocabulary of intimacy that wasn't based on who they had been or who they might become, but on who they were now, in this present moment, with all their scars, questions, and uncertainties intact, learning each other's rhythms, boundaries, and needs. Eleanor showed Thomas her life. She introduced him to the Pemberton children, despite the awkwardness of the situation, took him to places in Hartford that were important to her, let him see her daily routines and small rituals, the common texture of her existence rather than some edited and idealized version created to impress or attract. Thomas reciprocated by sharing his own vulnerabilities, talking about professional difficulties he hadn't mentioned to anyone. There were moments of physical closeness, hands touching as they walked, shoulders brushing as they read together. One night when Thomas tucked a loose strand of Eleanor's hair behind her ear, with such tenderness that she felt tears welling up in her eyes. And these moments seemed less like progress toward some predetermined goal, and more like the natural expression of affection between two people learning to trust each other with their true selves. Spring arrived in Hartford with the peculiar insistence that defines the New England seasons. And Eleanor found herself experiencing the seasonal shift metaphorically, as if her own inner landscape were transforming in the same way. Thomas had been superintendent for 6 months, long enough that his presence in Hartford no longer seemed temporary or provisional, long enough that they had established patterns and routines that suggested something more lasting than a simple reconnection, something that was beginning to resemble a real relationship. They dined together twice a week, alternating between restaurants and Eleanor's modest home, where she cooked and Thomas helped with the preparations and cleaning. These evenings became landmarks in Eleanor's life, something she looked forward to. The question of their future began to emerge naturally in conversations, practical considerations about how they could structure their lives to accommodate what was clearly becoming a partnership. Should Eleanor continue living in her current residence, or would it make sense to find something closer to where Thomas was renting rooms? Should she continue working with the Pemberton children, a situation that had become delicate after Margaret's discovery and Elizabeth's gossip, although both parties maintained professional courtesy? Or should she look for another job, perhaps even consider working in the education system, where Thomas could help her find a position that better utilized her skills? These discussions were careful and thoughtful, both trying to balance individual autonomy with the desire for greater integration. They were learning each other's limits, discovering where flexibility was possible and where it wasn't. And Eleanor appreciated that Thomas approached these conversations as negotiations between equals, rather than decisions he would make and she would accept. Thomas proposed to her one Sunday afternoon in late April, during one of their walks along the river, the same path where their serious conversations had begun months before. He said he wasn't offering her a fairy tale, wasn't promising that everything would be easy or uncomplicated, wasn't suggesting that their respective fears and wounds would magically disappear just because they declared commitment. But he was offering his real self, imperfect, sometimes difficult, still learning to open up emotionally, and was asking in return for her real self, not an idealized version. The proposal was honest, mature, and realistic in ways that Eleanor deeply appreciated, and yet she found herself hesitant, unable to simply say yes, even though a part of her desperately wanted to. Even though she could see the life they could build together and found it appealing, she needed to understand if she was choosing the Thomas of the present or the past, if she was trying to recover something lost or build something genuinely new. Eleanor needed to know that she was making this choice from the present, not the past, that she wasn't simply trying to rewrite history or correct an old mistake, that her commitment would be to who Thomas really was now, not who she had imagined him to be, that she was capable of finding him as an equal partner, not as someone seeking completeness in another person. She asked Thomas for time to think, and to her credit, he didn't pressure her, didn't interpret her hesitation as rejection, seemed to understand that important decisions require space and reflection, that immediate enthusiasm could, in fact, be less reliable than careful deliberation. Eleanor spent the following weeks in a state of productive uncertainty, actively questioning her own motivations and desires, trying to distinguish between what she really wanted and what she thought she should want. After 3 weeks of reflection, Eleanor invited Thomas to her house one night and told him that she wanted to accept his marriage proposal, but with certain conditions, certain clarifications about what she needed and what she could promise. She said she wanted to continue her work in some way, that maintaining her professional identity and purpose was important to her, that she couldn't simply be Mrs. Ashford, but needed to continue being Eleanor as well, with her own projects, commitments, and ways of contributing to the world beyond the domestic sphere. She said she was afraid of losing herself, afraid of giving in so much that she would wake up one day without recognizing her own life, and that she needed him to actively help her maintain boundaries and autonomy, even when it was inconvenient or created friction. Thomas listened very attentively and then said he wanted the same things for himself, that he needed her to confront him when work consumed him, to remind him that there was more to life than professional achievements, to help him stay connected to the parts of himself that had nothing to do with authority, responsibility, or public role. And as they sat together in Eleanor's small living room, discussing the practical and emotional architecture of what their marriage would be like, she felt something settle in her chest, a deep certainty that this was right, that this was the relationship worth risking, that reconciliation wasn't about reclaiming the past, but about building a future that honored both who they had been and who they were becoming. They married in June, in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Nothing elaborate or ostentatious, just a gathering of people important to them. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress, carried wildflowers picked that morning in a meadow on the outskirts of town, And as she recited her vows, she wasn't thinking of the Eleanor who had written that letter 8 years before, full of desperate hope and romantic longing, but of the Eleanor she was now, still hopeful but no longer desperate, still believing in love, but understanding it as something more complex and demanding than she had once imagined. Thomas stood before her looking slightly nervous, which she found charming and comforting, proof that he too understood the weight of what they were about to undertake, that he didn't approach marriage with carefree confidence but with humility. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, each word carefully chosen, and when they kissed at the end, Eleanor didn't feel fireworks or overwhelming passion, but something more tranquil and lasting, a sense of accomplishment, of finally arriving at a place she had been walking towards for longer than she had imagined. The first few months of marriage were a lesson in the distance between intention and execution, between commitments made in moments of lucidity and the reality of trying to honor them day by day. Eleanor and Thomas had their conflicts and misunderstandings, moments when old patterns of self-protection resurfaced, when fear manifested as withdrawal, criticism, or attempts at control, when the hurt and disappointment of past lost connection unexpectedly resurfaced, and they found themselves not only navigating present disagreements, but also processing past grief, grappling with the ghost of who they could have been if they had been braver, more honest, or simply luckier at the right time. But they had built something valuable in those months of careful reconnection before marriage, a foundation of honest communication, the practice of actually saying difficult things instead of letting them fester, a commitment to treating the relationship as something that required ongoing attention and work, rather than something that would simply continue on its own. Eleanor continued teaching, although she moved out of the Pemberton home for a position in the public schools that Thomas had helped organize, a role that utilized her skills more fully and gave her more autonomy and creative control. Thomas had more difficulty balancing work and marriage with his professional responsibilities, constantly threatening to consume all available time and attention. But Eleanor resisted this tendency, insisting on maintaining boundaries regarding the couple's evenings and weekends, reminding him that he had chosen a serious relationship and needed to dedicate himself to it. They developed rituals and rhythms, breakfast together before the day's demands began, evening walks when the weather permitted, Sunday afternoons reserved for conversation and connection instead of chores or social obligations, small structures that protected the relationship from being suffocated by everything else that demanded their attention. Thomas, for his part, seemed to be learning similar lessons, more willing to admit when he was struggling or insecure, rather than maintaining the competent professional facade he displayed in public. Eleanor watched him slowly change over those months, saw him become more integrated, less divided between his public and private self, and understood that this was one of the benefits of a genuine relationship. It created space for wholeness, allowed him to bring into the relationship parts of himself that were usually kept hidden or repressed, allowed him to be seen more fully, and if he was lucky, to be loved not despite his complexity, but because of it. Because the chosen person values authenticity more than perfection, values knowing who you really are more than maintaining comfortable illusions. They had both spent so many years protecting themselves, building elaborate defenses against potential hurt, and now they were engaged in the vulnerable work of dismantling those defenses, of learning to trust that security doesn't have to mean isolation, that you can let someone get close without losing yourself, that interdependence isn't the same as dependence, that needing another person doesn't make you weak or pathetic, but simply human. The story didn't end with certainty or complete resolution. It didn't offer the perfect ending that fiction usually provides, because real life doesn't work that way, because the work of a relationship is continuous and never truly ends, because love isn't a destination you reach but a practice you dedicate yourself to, a direction you choose to follow even when the path isn't clear and the outcome isn't guaranteed. Eleanor and Thomas would face more challenges, struggles, disappointments, and need to reconcile and recommit countless times over the years to come. But they had built something worth keeping, something worth fighting for, something worth the vulnerability and risk that genuine intimacy demands. And as Eleanor sat at dusk with Thomas's warm hand in hers, she felt grateful for the long and winding road that had brought them there, grateful even for the years of separation and lost time, because those years had shaped them, taught them things they needed to know before they could truly meet as equals, given them the hard-won wisdom that can only be acquired through living, failing, and trying again. And she recognized that although the letter had never been sent in the way she intended, it had been answered nonetheless. Not with words, but with presence, with commitment, with the daily choice to be there for another person in all their complexity. And that answer was worth everything it had cost and everything it would continue to cost in the ongoing work of truly loving someone.